to the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture with Darren Walker. Our topic today is From Inequality to Justice in the South. I'm Judith Kelly. I'm the Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy. And I want to welcome all of you here tonight to what I hope will be an opportunity for all of us to just get a little bit uncomfortable. We're here today for a conversation about some hard topics. And while it's wonderful to have our guests with us here today, I hope that you'll all open up your hearts and your minds to think about the hard questions before us. The Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture is endowed by the Keenan Charitable Trust, and it's become a flagship event for the Sanford School. We had some of the most prestigious speakers, public servants in particular. It's reserved for people who serve the public good through public service or leadership in other ways, artists, community leaders. And so our distinguished guest tonight fits very well in this mold. And Darren Walker has come here today for this keynote address, but is here with us throughout the spring for a three-part conversation, not just with our campus, but with the community of North Carolina. And in that spirit and in that effort to organize that, I am really happy to thank the partners that have helped make that possible. First and foremost, Wesley Hogan from the Center for Documentary Studies, and Don Taylor from the Sanford School, who really are leading this community effort, but also other partners from UNC. We have the College of Arts and Sciences and Southern Futures and other community partners that will be part of this conversation throughout this spring. And I think that when you hear the conversation on the stage today, you'll understand why this is the right approach to be taking in this context. So thank you to all of those partners for being part of this effort. Everybody will be able to follow along. We have a hashtag for this, Walker in NC, hashtag Walker in NC. He's a social media phenomenon. And the Terry Sanford Lecture, as is obvious from the name, is named after the namesake of our school, Terry Sanford, the president of Duke University, a visionary in many ways in his own relationship to the community, and also, of course, senator and founder of the Terry Sanford School of Public Policy. And public policy continues to be at the center of the conversation for most important topics of the day. Public policy has created many of the problems that we face today, but is also part of the solution to the issues that we face. So I am delighted to now introduce to you a couple of my faculty members. First and foremost, I am going to introduce you to Jay Pierson. So Jay Pierson, in case you're confused, is the gentleman on your right. Jay Pierson is an assistant professor, right? Soon to be promoted to associate professor of the practice. And his research examines how structural inequality operating through majority versus minority social status distinction influences and differentially determines life chances and lived experiences and health. Jay is himself a native of North Carolina, and I think it is fair to say that if you had understood where Jay was born and how Jay lived in his early childhood, very few of you would have assigned a probability that he would sit on stage today. And so Jay really comes to this evening with lived experiences that are incredibly appropriate for the conversation we're about to have. He served also in the Peace Corps, as a migrant, farm worker, health educator for a while, as assistant project director for an inner city research project. And every day we're so grateful for the depth of experience that he brings to this university. He is, as I said, an assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy, and he has faculty appointments also in global health, in Dupree's Population Research Center, and Science and Society. So he's going to start the conversation shortly. The other faculty member I'm going to introduce you to now, and we'll come to the podium shortly, is President Price, who is the Walter Hines Page Professor of Public Policy and Political Science, although we don't see a lot of him over at the Sanford School. One of these days he'll show up for work, I'm sure. But for now, I would like to invite him to this podium. Please welcome President Price.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here. I apologize for my inability to hang out at the Sanford School as often as I'd like. It's an exciting place, so exciting that we nearly had the announcement of a promotion right here. Jay, congratulations.
It's on the record.
I'm truly delighted to be here this evening to welcome Darren Walker to Duke. He serves as president of the Ford Foundation and will be our 2020 Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecturer. And I have to say, given all of Mr. Walker's extraordinary accomplishments, whoever introduces him has their work cut out for them. Born in Lafayette, Louisiana, Darren Walker was one of the first children in the nation to benefit from the Head Start program. He went on to earn a scholarship at the University of Texas at Austin, where he would graduate with degrees in government, speech communication, and law, before pursuing a successful career as an attorney and an investment banker. For the past 3 decades, Mr. Walker has been one of our nation's foremost philanthropic executives. He has served as Chief Operating Officer of Harlem's largest development corporation, Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation, co-founder and chair of the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, and for the past 7 years as president of the Ford Foundation, where he oversees an endowment of $13 billion and $600 million in annual grant making. He is dedicated to tackling the most difficult issues in the world. He was among the most committed supporters of residents in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. He led the way toward building a more just and financially sustainable future for the city of Detroit. And as president of the Ford Foundation, he is contributing to the economic empowerment of tens of millions of Americans across the country, including here in the South. In a groundbreaking 2015 essay toward a new gospel of wealth, and more recently in his book, From Generosity to Justice, Mr. Walker called upon Americans to rethink the way we approach philanthropy, to shift from a charity-minded approach to one that addresses the inequality that necessitated the charity in the first place. In that spirit, he's announced that the Ford Foundation's giving, in reversal from its first 50 years, would focus solely on funding projects that address inequality. Tonight's just an introduction. As Edith said, Mr. Walker will be visiting Duke, we're fortunate to say, several times this spring, working alongside students, faculty, and staff to forge partnerships with our neighbors here in Durham aimed at combating injustice in the South. He is a leader of uncommon vision and purpose. I am delighted to have him here at Duke. Please join me in welcoming Darren Walker.
So, good evening, good people, and welcome again to the 2020 Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture. My name again is Jay Pierson, and tonight I have the honor, indeed the pleasure, of sharing the stage with Mr. Darren Walker, who serves as the current president of the Ford Foundation. In the interest of time and not overwhelming you with repetition on Mr. Walker's accomplishments and honorifics, addressed during President Price and Dean Kelly's introductions, I'll take a minute or so to lay out the format for tonight's event. Mr. Walker and I will share the stage in directed conversation for about 35 minutes. We will then entertain questions from audience members. We have mic runners who will come to you if you raise your hand. And we ask that you first stand if you are approached, and that you try your best to have a concise, well-formed question. So thank you in advance. As discussed by Dean Kelly, while truthful and honest discussions on serious issues like inequality, injustice, supremacy, oppression, and domination are by their very nature likely to be discomforting for some of us, we hope that our exchange this evening will also be enlightening. That is, we hope that you don't miss the important message associated with this discussion. If you've read the book or have seen previous interviews, you already know the compelling life story of Mr. Walker, as well as the groundbreaking work he's doing at the Ford Foundation and inspiring at other organizations. Tonight, we propose to merge these two perspectives, the personal and the professional. As someone who has emerged from the populations and communities philanthropy frequently proposes to serve, Mr. Walker benefits from a unique constellation of lived experiences that grant insight into the phenomenon characterizing inequality different from those brought to bear by the typical head of a philanthropic organization. That is his real value. We will delve into how lessons learned from these experiences have influenced and informed his thoughts, vision, plan, and action as pertains to the Ford Foundation's mission, that of philanthropy writ large, as well as how they hold promise for improving the social well-being of the nation and the world. Finally, the topics and questions we will be discussing this evening were solicited and collected from a series of collaborative meetings and conversations between Durham community members, Duke staff, as well as faculty. Out of recognition of and respect for the value of the diverse range of perspectives associated with these contributions, I will indicate those questions that were conceived of in advance by Durham community members. So, Mr. Walker, let's start with the big picture question. You open your book with a statement written by Andrew Carnegie some 131 years ago. In it, he cites the importance of philanthropy addressing inequality. The previously referenced North Carolina Fund to End Poverty and Inequality, championed by Terry Sanford, was funded by the Ford Foundation 57 years ago. From your perspective, what, if anything, about the nature of inequality and how philanthropy proposes to adjust it has changed since Carnegie's observations and Ford's efforts, and from Ford's efforts until today?
Thank you, Professor, and good evening, everyone. I feel really blessed and enormously grateful for the invitation to be the Terry Sanford lecturer this semester. Of course, the opportunity to come to Duke, to this amazingly magical place that seems otherworldly in its beauty and in its excellence and in its richness. You can't help but feel that this is a rich place, and it reeks of it. And it is an interesting thing that we'll get to in a moment, but I do want to say that it is just always such a warm embrace when I come to Durham. And it's why when my friend Joel Fleischman once again intervened in my life to probably rig the system so I could be named the Terry Sanford Lecturer, I readily accepted. I think your question of Andrew Carnegie and the fund for North Carolina and today is a very important one that really, first of all, we have to acknowledge Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a radical for his day. Andrew Carnegie believed that everyone in America should be literate, should have a library, have library books. He actually didn't have a problem with inequality. Andrew Carnegie believed that inequality was just a natural phenomenon, and that the real question was, what did men like himself who benefited from their natural hard work and their superior intelligence and all of the things that brought them their wealth. What would they do with that wealth to benefit society? He was a radical, but he doesn't look like a radical today. The fund for North Carolina that Governor Sanford led was also a radical idea, a disruptive idea, because it challenged the status quo in this state. It demanded that institutions look at the ways in which they existed and engaged with particularly poor, low income, Black communities. And I think we have to acknowledge that while we in this country have made tremendous progress, everything has changed and nothing has changed. And what I mean by that is we have made phenomenal progress in this country at reducing the disparities, at demonstrating the potential for us to see the benefits of better integrated schools, employment that works for more people. We have demonstrated tremendous progress. Those demonstrations have been just that, demonstration projects. We have been unable to, at scale, sustain the progress. And that is, to my mind, the greatest challenge. Because we actually, generally speaking, know what works. Name a social ill, a challenge that we face as a country. And there is a demonstration or a series of demonstrations that show us what work. Name something. How to increase student achievement for young Black boys. We know how to do that in this country. And there have been randomized controlled trials out the wazoo to show us where it has worked. Those have been demonstrations. We have been unwilling to scale them, to invest in them, and to sustain those investments. So my challenge is to all of us and to philanthropy is to demand that we look at the root causes of, one, the problems that we are identifying, and two, what's the root cause of our inability to invest in the things we know that works? Andrew Carnegie believed in literacy, but he didn't question that the Negro libraries got secondhand books or no books at all. John D. Rockefeller was a radical to establish Spelman College, to take what had been a small fledgling college for Negro women and to believe that Negro women should have a 4-year degree was a radical idea. Now, he wasn't creating a scholarship program to send those Negro girls to Radcliffe or Vassar with his daughters. And there was a curriculum designed for those women that was different from the curriculum that was designed for his daughters. But he believed that they should be educated. But the root causes were left unexamined. And part of the reason the root causes were left unexamined is because Privileged people do not like being made uncomfortable. And to engage in a root cause interrogation makes the beneficiaries of the very systems and structures that produce their advantage, it makes them vulnerable. And one of the great things about privilege, because I've lived with privilege and I've lived without privilege, living with privilege is really good. Because what privilege is supposed to buy you is insulation from being uncomfortable. Right? I mean, how many times have I heard parents say, I've worked hard so that you can have the privilege that I didn't have. So that those things that I had to worry about, you don't have to worry about. You can take for granted. That's privilege. And every parent wants that for their child, particularly a parent who grew up hard or poor, but that privilege then insulates them from actually engaging in some of these really difficult conversations.
Thank you. It sounds like you're talking about different but persistent manifestations of inequality, enduring inequality. So the second question is, and the title of tonight's talk is Moving from Inequality to Justice. There's a rapidly evolving body of literature in the world that I live in the academy, that addresses different types of inequality. For example, economic, racial, or structural. There are also multiple definitions of these different types of inequalities based on the response that you just gave. Can you share with us what type of inequality you believe is the root cause and how you propose to define that type of inequality?
I think the root cause is racism and classism. I think and it becomes incredibly uncomfortable. First, because in this country, we believe, I believe, I believe in America. I am certain that there is no place in the world where someone with your background or my background could have experienced in one generation the level of social and economic mobility we have experienced. So I was born in the bottom decile, and I am absolutely right in the 1%. And I am grateful for that. But that does not blind me to the reality of the historic racism that is imbued in our very foundation. And how we in this country have that conversation where we are comfortable with the contradictions of who we are rather than a romanticized version. I love Thomas Jefferson, and I get hell because I opened my annual letter a couple of years ago with a quote from Jefferson to his friend Samuel DuPont in 1816. And he wrote Samuel DuPont and he said, "The work of America is to build a just nation." So I included that. And, I got some people saying on Twitter, why would you be quoting that horrible racist Sally Hemings, all that stuff, right? Because Jefferson's words were brilliant, were absolutely brilliant. Now, yes, he was a hypocrite. Absolutely. But I want to hold Jefferson to his words. And so I use his words to demand of him that he deliver on those words, in spite of his hypocrisy. and to hold his hypocrisy and his brilliance at once. Because in spite of the fact that our founders were racist, they also left us the tools to fix what was wrong. And so I think where we have to begin in this country is to have an ability to manage the complexity of both of those narratives in a nation where we have only had a narrative of deification, right? So we have had a narrative that is this romanticized idea of America. And that romanticized idea, I hold that too. But I also hold a reality that is the lived experience, certainly of folks of color, of poor white people. And that, to me, is what's critical to our ability to engage. And I think what has happened is in our society today, too many of us are taking oppositional positions on that narrative continuum. And some feel that it is important to protect, and some feel that we have to tear it down. Right? And I believe that we have to be able to bridge, because we are like the soul of any of us. I mean, if you have any religious tradition or you believe anything, I mean, I grew up in the South as a Baptist, and I mean, we have a soul, but our souls need nourishment. And we, if left to our own will do things that are harmful to our souls. And souls need healing. And I think that's what this country needs. And so, how do we think about the kinds of conversations that help us heal? And understand, you got to be able to diagnose what we're healing from. That's a part of it.
So you open by referencing Jefferson and the move towards a just nation. Can you give us a definition of what that would look like, and how you imagine that? What does justice look like, and how do we get there? What's the pathway?
I think the pathway is to recognize that our democracy is defined by a set of systems, structures, cultural and social practices. And those systems, beginning with the economic system, is designed to get us what we got. So there is no facet of our life in this country, and there is no social problem that we should be surprised about the outcomes, right? So none of us should be surprised about the fact that we are the most overly incarcerated nation in the world on a per capita basis. That's a fact. And we have designed a criminal justice system to get us that. I mean, I'm not surprised. If you look at the inputs into the outputs, it is actually a perfectly designed system to get us that. And so every aspect of our lives, those systems and the design of them, will get us more justice or less justice. And so I think we have to focus on every system and ask ourselves, is this system designed to generate more justice, more fairness, or is it designed to create more injustice? And this is not a unique phenomenon. I mean, the Ford Foundation has offices all around the world, and inequality is a function of the way societies, and particularly those who are privileged, design society. I mean, I was in our office in Eastern Africa, and the head of our people and culture said, we have got to hire, we have hired an overabundance of Kikuyas because the Lua ethnic groups in the office feel like that the Kikuyas are already privileged in that society. Why is it that the assets, who's now, to many of my colleagues, I mean, they're just all black in East Africa. How hard can it be? Well, they have inequality too. And it is designed by privileged ethnic groups to benefit them. And the minority ethnic tribes and groups, I mean, the conversation is about how they are excluded and how the privileged ethnic group at the top of the pyramid makes it hard for them to enter and have access to. This is because people design structures that are based on historic, that are intended to create hierarchy. And that is a global phenomenon. And in the United States has absolutely manifest in the way in which racism and white supremacy was designed, right? And everything around.
Incorrectly, you're suggesting that inequality provide improvements in birth outcomes as illustrative of how justice-informed movements improve social conditions and reduce inequality. The US, however, has not seen similar improvements in birth outcomes, and Black birth outcome differences, particularly maternal mortality, actually formal education. In fact, white American women who have less than a high school education have better birth outcomes than Black American women who have college degrees, right? So, how do we square that circle? To you, what does that reflect about the US social order, particularly the state of affairs on this inequality and injustice?
It reflects the depth at which race correlates with progress. Race, not income, because income is not necessarily an equalizer. And so the of how is it that you have Black women with a 4-year credential, with higher income, achieving poorer health outcomes than white women with less income? How else can you explain that? I mean, I think the data and the research on this, the way in which has prevented, constrained, even economic gains do not translate into better social.
What are the essential or core characteristics of a just or justice-informed partnership between funders, universities, and those individuals, families, communities who are living and by extension disproportionately impacted by the inequality phenomenon? Funders and researchers like you and I are interested and propose to understand and offset. How do we get those perspectives represented? And this is a community-generated question.
Sure. Well, I think one of the real important ways we achieve that is first by recognizing and owning our power and the power imbalance and the resource imbalance and how that can distort our behaviors. We in philanthropy have well, I would say humility, but it's a fake sense of humility in that we simply will say, "Oh, we're just here to help," or we're just, um, and I think that is harmful if we're not willing, because in order to get to a better relationship and engagement with communities, we have to recognize the power imbalance and how, and therefore how we own that. I mean, how we, in the way in which we engage, which first has to be that we don't privilege credentialed knowledge over the lived experience and the perspectives of people closest to the challenge. That we don't say that we're going to bring experts in, because the people who are in those communities are the experts too. And I remember when I worked, before I went to Rockefeller, and I worked up on 138th Street in Harlem in the 90s, which was a very different Harlem than today. Um, Harlem, when like nobody wanted, we were practically giving away brownstones. We couldn't get people to move to Harlem. Um, but there were times when we felt like we were the the guinea pigs, the uh, sort of uh, rats that are the lab rats or whatever. I mean, when you feel a sense of being observed, being monitored, being uh, analyzed, but never being at the table as a full partner. And I just think that part of that requires, like from day one, the design of whatever the engagement is should like have that be the preamble to whatever the intervention is.
Brilliant. What kinds of funding opportunities and mechanisms might Ford have currently existing that actually inform that perspective? Like, how do you get the folks who have boots on the ground, right, and represent the perspectives of those populations? Do you have those? And this is also a community member generated question.
Well, my former trustee, Martin Eakes, who knows all about the Ford Foundation's design of these initiatives since I've been president, will tell you that one of the things we have learned from his organization and organizations like it is the thing in terms of resources that nonprofits need that they cannot get is general support, right? That the first kind of funding that matters most, just as it does to any venture enterprise, is flexible capital. What philanthropy provides the least is flexible capital. So to my mind, that's like an indication of how you see both strategy and your partners. So one of the things we initiated, the trustees approved 5 years ago a $2 billion initiative, a new initiative that is all general support and that funds a set of key institutions we believe are on the front lines of fighting for racial and gender equality. Uh, and and what that has meant is that we have gone from our report for we were 21% of our spend was general support, and we now are 75% as of last year. And so, it should be 100%, although my colleagues say it can never be 100% because, well, there are certain things that we have to. But I say that to say, um, but we had to change our strategy too, because if you're going to do general support, your strategy has to be strengthening those institutions you're funding, right? And so your whole headset has to change as a foundation, where you say, actually, our work is to invest in institutions and people. That's our work. That's our strategy. Now, most foundations, including Ford, I mean, the strategy has been something that's been designed. quantitatively. I mean, it's not like designed in a conference room, but it's been designed, and there are a set of outcomes, and we fund organizations to get those outcomes. And that's admirable. So we fund an organization to reduce uh, uh, teen pregnancy. We funded. I believe that if we fund the organizations, our outcomes should be attached to their outcomes, right? So we should be informed by saying, all right, if we're working on, if we want to reduce racial inequality, and there are a set of organizations whose mission it is to do that, so get them in a room, the Legal Defense Fund, I mean, just name all the organizations doing that, design a collective strategy that is about strengthening each of those institutions, develop those indicators, develop the outcomes for those groups, and give them general support to do that, and give them multi-year general support. And this again is getting into the weeds, but I say this to my foundation friends because this is one of the things that makes me crazy about foundations, and that is, so the board approves a budget. The board approves a 1-year budget. And so when you ask someone, why can't you do more multi-year grants? They say, well, because my board only approves a 1-year budget. The Ford board only approved a 1-year budget. But the Ford board could approve a 5-year budget if it wanted to. There's nothing that says you can't approve a multi-year budget. I understand why some organizations, conservatively and otherwise, in terms of fiscal management, but there are ways to prudently scenario plan worst case scenarios and know that you will have the money to pay out. Why don't we do more of that? In order to we didn't have a $2 billion budget, but the trustees, after a lot of work with our CIO, with the financial people, felt comfortable as fiduciaries that they could approve a 5-year budget that was $2 billion. And so we could start paying out those grants right away. So the good news for our grantees was that some of those organizations, the larger ones, got $10 million. And some of them, we gave them $6 million in year 1 and the $4 million in year 2 of a 5-year grant. We can do that. Why don't we do that? So I guess I'm just saying there are ways in which, if you believe in community beyond the rhetoric, that you manifest that in your programming.
So, when you came to the Ford Foundation, you sold the existing art collection and used the funds to replace it with pieces from a significantly more diverse group of contemporary artists. You also oversaw the purchase of ebony and jet collections and donated them to the archives at the Museum of African American History. Why'd you make those changes?
So the art. Okay, so
And this is
so
a community director.
there was a wonderful Ford Foundation art collection that Mr. Ford, Henry Ford II, when the headquarters was built, amassed, and it was a beautiful collection. We had Renoir, Chagall, Monet, Manet. I mean, it was really quite lovely. I would say art historians would say that we had a lot of names, but it wasn't like any of it was like the best or anything. But we had a lot of names. So, you know, when the trustees and I, as we started to reimagine the building, because this was part of a larger strategy to move the building from being a kind of a fortress and just for us to being a community destination, space for nonprofits and other things. I said to the trustees, we have an art collection that is all white men, mostly European, and there's one woman. And we're a foundation that just approved a new mission to focus on inequality and diversity in the world. We should sell the art. And the good news is the Ford trustees are a remarkable group of people. I mean, exceedingly distinguished people who are relentlessly focused on advancing the foundation's mission. And I think they really understood that. So we call Christie's, and not to everyone's pleasure, but we did deaccession the art. We did sell the collection, and that then made it possible because we didn't want to use grant dollars or any budget. So that in turn made it possible for us to begin to acquire a new Ford collection. Um, the first piece we acquired is, an 8-foot tall Kehinde Wiley, who did the portrait of President Obama. That is this just quite remarkable portrait of a woman called Wanda Critchlow from Brooklyn, who it's gotten a lot of media because it's such an amazing uh, uh, portrait to have down in our lobby. But now uh, our collection is about 80% women of color and people and queer and diverse in lots of different ways. And I think people notice it, and it's been written about a lot, and it's gotten a lot of attention. I think because it does reflect our sense of who we are as a foundation.
Thank you. And so we've reached the point of our session where we will take questions from the audience. And please, again, remember succinct, well thought out, precise questions, right? And so we have mic runners who will be making the rounds. And so raise your hands if you're interested. Otherwise, I have additional questions and we will continue the dialogue here. No questions? Do we have one? Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Emily Hadley. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I really enjoyed your presentation or conversation, sorry. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, very early on, you talked about how we know what to do, but we just don't do it. And I think sometimes I've worked with some foundations, and foundations Ford Foundation has a lot of resources, but at the end of the day, it still is limited as compared to the government, for example. Could you talk a little bit about what you see as the limits of foundations' work, and what you see the government's role is playing, and how Ford Foundation works with the government, and in what capacities?
Emily, that's a great question. And I actually don't believe that the Ford Foundation or philanthropy writ large can achieve any of our the solutions we would wish at scale. I mean, no foundation can do that. Not the Gates Foundation, not the Ford Foundation. And consequently, we have to believe in public policy. We have to believe in the potential of government to act responsibly, to scale, to both experiment and to be a partner with philanthropy. But ultimately, if we want to scale a large public challenge, government and public policy are the pathway. And unfortunately, we have allowed in this country the idea of degrading government, of degrading public goods. So anything that's public becomes negative. I mean, there's something negative associated with it. Public housing, public transportation, public schools, public parks. So all of these things are our public assets. And when we start to privatize them and say, well, the solution is privatizing the public, I believe that we will regret that. And I believe that that can, in fact, accelerate the kinds of inequality. And I think it has contributed to accelerating the inequality. And philanthropy's role should, I believe, should be actually shining a light on that, actually lifting that up which is not always easy because we sometimes participate, right? So I'll take my own city. We have an amazing park called Central Park that is funded 100% by private wealth. And the worst days of New York City, bankruptcy, a group of amazing private citizens proposed to the city that they would take over the revitalization of the park. And they have done an amazing job, and they should be commended for that. But the Central Park Conservancy's success, some would argue, has contributed to the degradation of parks in the Bronx and in Queens and Staten Island, because this idea that actually we don't need a robust public park system in New York. Look at Central Park. Look at the High Line. Look, those are unique situations that exist because of the geography of those parks. And to extrapolate from that, a public policy that says, so you see, we just need to allow the privatization. Because those communities in the South Bronx and on Staten Island don't have billionaires living on them, don't have the wealth, don't have people who say, well, I want to make sure that when I take my kids into that playground in the park that it's clean. They have that aspiration, but they don't have the wealth. And so if we, again, go back to all the systems that are public, that are being privatized, philanthropy should be in the role not of accelerating that, but of calling that out as itself a contributor to the very problem we're trying to solve.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. I've really enjoyed this. But I've missed something along the way. There's a word up there says justice, and I don't understand exactly how you interpret that word. Could you help me with that?
Justice for me is rooted for me in my religious teachings. The idea of social justice, of fairness, of every human being being worthy of dignity, of not experiencing indifference because of some physical or other quality that renders them the other. And to my mind, justice, and this is why I worry in philanthropy, because in philanthropy, justice, as it is in our society more broadly, is a contested term. The number of foundation people, I've had in the last year, 2 presidents of big foundations say to me, my board would never be comfortable with all of that social justice stuff you talk about at Ford. Like, really? Like, your board doesn't like, no, we talk about opportunity. We talk about leveling the playing field. We talk about, so let's dance around in the language that makes us comfortable. When in fact, the core issue, yes, we can talk about opportunity. So let's talk about who has it and who doesn't. But if we are actually going to deal with the core issues, we have to deal with justice. It's just in philanthropy, I am surprised by how often I find resistance when we started to say at Ford that we were a social justice philanthropy. Not because we wanted to say we were special or neat or cool or anything. It was to say, actually, social justice philanthropy demands something else of us. Right? When in 1968, when Dr. King talked about philanthropy, and he had a different idea than Carnegie or Rockefeller, because he said philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary. That was a very different idea than Carnegie's idea. It was an idea that says, actually, philanthropists, you need to interrogate the ways in which you have become so privileged that you have all of this money to give away when so many others don't have the subsistence to live a life of dignity. And how do you as a philanthropist think about engaging in that conversation? And so justice to me looks like philanthropists engaging in that conversation to interrogate those systems and structures rather than investing in the things that actually affirm your advantage. And that is really, really hard to do. I was at a dinner party in New York City with a group of progressive, super successful people, black and white. So this was not and most of them gone to private schools and Ivy Leagues. And someone said, "Oh, I read your Times and it was really good." And I said, "Well, did you read the part where I said we should do away with legacy admissions?" 2A1, including all the black people at the table who themselves were all first generation, but were said absolutely not do away with legacy. How do you think we're going to address inequality? And so one of my friends, who was a very successful banker on Wall Street, African American, prep for prep, grew up in public housing, I said to him, "I'm not worried about your children. I'm worried about who you used to be, right? Your kids are going to be fine. I mean, there isn't an Ivy League school in America who's not going to accept a black kid who went to Dalton, who doesn't need financial aid, and whose father's a legacy. I mean, I'm not worried about your kids. Like, the kids who we all used to be, that's who we should be worried about. Do they still have opportunity in this country? Can they still dream the way we all dreamed?" And so to me, that's what justice looks like. When people like that start to say, actually, we need to not give back, we need to give up. And that's the difference in what I'm talking about, in looking at philanthropy from the standpoint and looking at our own personal behavior, which is, again, where it gets really, really hard, because we started with this point about privilege. The whole point of privilege, the whole point of your being able to donate a lot of money to a private school and have a leg up for your child is to buy that for them. And you're going to step aside and give that up? Who's going to do that?
Good evening. My name is Sulaika Santiago, and I'm an independent consultant here in Durham. Thank you for all that you have brought, for all of this truth-telling that you have brought. In particular, I am grateful for your affirmation of the value of people's lived experience and creating concrete avenues for people to actually participate. And so in that spirit, I wonder if you could speak to the importance of bringing participatory grant making to life and moving some of the decision-making power as an avenue for addressing inequality.
It's a great question. So participatory grant making is something that we are interested in and are experimenting with. And so we've done we have underway a couple of experiments, one with our disability rights program, and another with a group of foundations working in 3 or 4 communities. It will be, I'm very curious about this idea of participatory grant making. And I think it is another way in which we can think about democratizing philanthropy and the kinds of innovation that mean that we share more in in power, in process, in decision making. But let me be really clear. Um, the Ford Foundation is never going to turn over our endowment to the community to manage and make grants on. I mean, I don't pretend to be something I'm not. I The way we will get better and the way philanthropy gets better at grant making is to have more people in leadership positions who look like the communities we are seeking to serve. Because the more authentic understanding of the problems and the proximity to those problems that we have in our boardrooms and in our executive offices, I believe the better we will be as philanthropy. And while participatory grant making is one way in which we can do that, what I would not want to see is the demographics of philanthropy remain the same while in 10 or 20 years we've got 10% of our grant making in a participatory fund or something. To me, again, that's it's not a distraction, but it's much easier to take 5 or 10% of your budget and say, okay, we're going to do that participatory grant making thing over there, and nothing else has to change in what we're doing. What I'm saying is no, actually, we need to change. We need to look at our boards. We need to look at the senior staff of foundations and ask those questions and not allow things that are important, but that can actually become Trojan horses for something else.
I have a question here.
Hi, my name's Jesse Huddleston. I'm an alum here, and I'm also with the board of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. Thank you for being here. My question for you is a bit of a personal one, but it's a two-part one. You mentioned the word healing, and that's a word that has a deep resonance for me. Just thinking about my journey, being a pastor's kid, coming to Duke, leaving my family, and what it's meant to stay here, remain engaged in community, and my healing journey coming out as queer, remaining connected to my faith community has been dynamic and it's ongoing. And I'd love to hear, as you feel comfortable sharing, what healing is meaning for you, but also would love to hear what you think about collective healing and what that means on a broader public level. The last thing I would add, in the South.
No, that's really, really an important coda, that qualifier of in the South as a Southerner. I resonate. So I think this question of healing is one that is so deeply important for us now because we know that in some way we are broken and we feel it in our spirit and we sense it and we have to be able to first hope that our leaders can model for us what healing looks like and that we in our daily engagement with people contribute in very granular ways to the kind of healing that we need. I think that there is no doubt that for African American queer people, that the burden in our own community of homophobia is profound. And I remember, I'm reminded of something I hadn't thought about in a long time, but when I went to work at the Abyssinian Church in 1993, um, I, I had my desk in the basement, and there was a picture of my partner on the desk. And someone said to Reverend Butts, he has a picture of a white man on his desk. And Reverend Butts called me and he said, do you have a picture of a white man on your desk? And I said, yes, that's David. I have a picture of a white man on my desk because I have a white man at home. And he, I think it was in some ways culturally in a black church in Harlem in 1992, that was just not a normative thing. And what is the journey, and Reverend Butts and I have had this conversation on many occasions because we know that there have always been queers in the black church, always. And the way in which that has been acknowledged and or not has really contributed to some of the dysfunction of black men and black women who are queer. It is compounded by race. And I think that we have reached a point, and I know on my own journey and my own journey at Abyssinian Church, where a few years ago, David and I were at church, and Reverend Butts calls out from the pulpit, as happens at black churches when you're just sitting there, and all of a sudden he calls your name out and says, "What are you up to?" I mean, that sort of thing happens at black churches, and and he is like, I see that you and David have shown up. Where have y'all been? We haven't seen you here, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe this man is calling me out in church. Now, he would not have done that in 1992. He would not have called out two men, a couple, sitting on the fifth pew on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. So that's the journey. And that journey was his journey, my journey, our journey was informed by the experience of living and working together in a shared mission, the work of that church. And so I think that it's a process. And I think the collective work is the work that comes when people come together and have the courage to stand together. And that is not easy because today, too often, courage is discouraged. And taking the risk to stand up and stand out is not something that many people want to do in this Twitter cancel culture time in which we live. And I would just encourage you to do that.
We have time for one more question. Compelling. His hand went up enthusiastically. Would you like my mic?
Hi, I'm Ruby. I'm a local physician in the area. Hey, right here.
Hi, Ruby.
Hi. So, this is a question about community healing. Some of our local Durham residents that live in public housing, particularly McDougal Terrace, have been displaced for approximately a month because of chronically underfunded maintenance issues. And many of these residents feel like second-class citizens in our society. How, or from your experiences with Katrina and recovery, how did you integrate many of those citizens back into their community and include them so that they did not feel like second class or less than citizens? And how can bystanders in the community engage people that have lived in these terrible conditions?
Well, I think that this issue is and your question is a metaphor. There should be rage in the streets over that kind of injustice. And the rage ought to be as intense from the privileged part of town where people are living in nice big houses covered with ivy and nice cars in the driveway, as much as it should be from those residents who are living in temporary shelter. And that's often the challenge, is that the people who are calling City Hall, who are calling the Public Housing Authority, are not those people. The people who are doing that are the people themselves who are the most vulnerable and often have the least power and resources. And so again, I come back to the question of what do we privileged people say and do in a case like that? And I will only say that New Orleans, while there is much to be proud of in New Orleans, not all of those people in public housing got their housing back after Katrina. And so we should also be really clear that the process of addressing the solutions to challenges like public housing is multi-layered and very complex. But in the specific instance, I mean, we had a situation in Queens like this a few weeks ago in New York, and we fund housing advocates, and so there's a lot of advocacy going on. But how do we get people who aren't themselves necessarily proximate to the problem to own that problem? And again, I don't want to put the burden to say, oh, if you're privileged, you should be going over and working on public housing. I mean, that's not necessarily what I'm saying, but I am